Welcome, case makers near and far. I'm Dr. Tiffany Manuel, and I'm the CEO and founder of The Case Made. One of the best things about the work that I do is that I get to travel the globe and I get to hear amazing people who are doing the kind of things in their communities that are just so awesome. And when I hear great case making, there's only one thing that comes to mind: fierce. That's the energy of this series, and that's why I've invited you in. So come on in, take a listen. This is Fierce Case Making. Hey, listen, everybody, I am so excited to bring you this latest episode of Fierce Case Making. This is one of those interviews I would say that you are going to want to take out a pad, a pencil, spend some time with it, like get outdoors, like just listen, whatever it is, like close down your computer, whatever that you're working on, you want to really focus. I mean, there's so many gems in this from start to finish that you want to really listen hard. Listen for the conversation we had about how to talk about equity. Listen for the conversation about cows having Fitbits. And I would say listen for this conversation about just the art and science of persuasion. You cannot reason somebody out of something that they didn't reason themselves into. So listen, take the time, get your notepad. You are going to learn so much. Have at it. Fierce Case Making. Great. Amanda, welcome to Fierce Case Making.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
So listen, I am so excited to have you on. You and I connected just briefly. We were having a conversation about skills development and workforce development and how we could do a lot more to make sure that we make the case for the kinds of investments that are super important for workers across the nation to have what they need, right, to be ready for, I would say, the next generation of our economy and the next generation of a whole range of issues. And we just started vibing, having this whole conversation about decision making and how people make decisions. And I was like, wait a minute, wait. We need to take this to a public forum, right? We need to bring some other people into the conversation. So welcome. That we're going to do a whole series of things on that. So before we get to that, let's actually just first of all, just talk a little bit about what you do in the space. And, you've been doing a lot of work to help folks think about what it means to be investing in, right, skills, right, in your work. Talk a little bit about that. Just let everybody know kind of the stuff that you do and all that good stuff, why it matters.
Sure. Well, I'm Amanda Berkson-Shokak. I work for National Skills Coalition. We're a big tent bipartisan coalition of workforce and education advocates, and we're a policy advocacy organization. So we talk to governors and congresspeople and state legislators and others around the country about what it means to invest in good public policies that help workers get high quality training so they can get good jobs and support their families, and so that small businesses can get the skilled workers they need. But what that mostly means is that I'm talking to human beings all the time, human beings who have a lot on their plates, who have sometimes a background in the issues I'm talking to them about, sometimes they don't. And so I think all the time in my job about storytelling and advocacy. What does it mean to make the case for people? How do people make decisions? And how can I give them accurate information? My background is in public libraries, so we like our citations with librarians. Before I came to National Skills Coalition 9 years ago, I spent 9 years at a nonprofit in Philadelphia serving immigrants. And when you work on immigration as an issue, you get a lot of practice in being able to talk about big, heavy, complicated things in ways that are accessible to lots of different kinds of people.
Love that. We're going to vibe on the whole library thing too. I one of my first jobs was as a librarian in graduate school, and I loved it. We'll talk about that later. But in any event, so say more about that. You talk. I mean, you broke it down into the most essential core of this thing about you're talking to human beings, right? And I want to just start there because oftentimes in the policy space, we get so into the details of the thing. SB 155 or whatever, right? The policy number is, or whatever the piece of legislation is that we're trying to move, or even just the idea that we're trying to move things forward. And we start to talk the policy soup, right? The policy wonky wonk talk, right? And then we sort of look around and we say, but why isn't anybody following me? Especially folks who are on television, or they may be just average Americans just watching. They don't know the details of how we make investments in skills and workforce development. They're just trying to figure out like where their place is in the conversation, and they struggle to find a place in our wonky wonk talk. So talk a little bit about that. Just, we're talking to human beings. What does that take? Would love to hear your take on that.
So my colleague Katie Spiker likes to say, data makes you credible, but stories make you memorable. And human beings are wired for story. We have been telling story probably for as long as there has been language. We know for sure that oral storytelling as a history has existed for even longer than we've had written language in human societies, right? So we are wired from the very beginning to tell stories to ourselves about how the world works or how change happens, and to pay attention to the information that other people are giving us in the context of a story. And I say that because it can be awfully seductive for some folks, and I include myself in this group, to sometimes think that we're super rational decision makers. And if you hand us a position paper, we're going to read that position paper and we're going to figure out the most rational response, and then we're going to do the thing. And sometimes when I talk to people, I say, okay, think back on the last decision you made. How did you make that decision? And almost invariably, people will say, well, I talked to someone I trusted. Okay, whether you're buying a new car, or you're trying to decide where to go to college, or you just want to go to dinner, And so, making sure that we tell our policy advocacy stories in ways that resonate with how real people actually make decisions in the real world. That's important whether you're talking to a congressperson or whether you're talking to a member of the public whose eyes are kind of glazed over as soon as you say the words policy advocacy, right? Like that's not a term that rolled off most people's tongues. So that's where I try to start in doing this.
Yeah, absolutely. Love that. Love that. We're going to bring that back too. Data makes you credible, but it's a story, right? That connects you to people. In the work that we do at The Case Made, we talk a lot about the kinds of stories that help to elevate, right, folks, to bring people closer. And one of the things that we often, I would say we struggle to sort of make people sort of present to, but we try to pull people forward on, is that stories have to include the folks you're talking to. If it's a story about somebody else, it's an interesting story. Just people have a hard time connecting that to why is that important for me. So one of the things we often talk to folks about is, listen, you got to tell stories of us, right? All of us together. And if you're talking to somebody and they can't find their way to be somewhere in that story, it's not as impactful. So talk a little bit about that, about the storytelling and the way that you sort of pull people into the story, like, hello, here's your role in this, so people can see, oh, I get it, right? There's a role for me here. And now it's just not about somebody else. It's also about me. There are some implications for me too. Yeah.
Yeah. So, at its core, storytelling is about empathy, about thinking from the other person's perspective. And I know you've talked about this in your book, in The Case Made, and in the work that you do professionally. But I'll give you an example from my former job. So I worked for a nonprofit. We were helping work-authorized immigrants find jobs. And sometimes we'd get a call from other nonprofits and they'd say, oh, can you give us the list of employers who hire immigrants? And I'd say, there's no such list. Nobody wakes up in the morning and says, I need to hire an immigrant. They wake up at 3:00 in the morning and they say, oh my gosh, my two best CNC operators are retiring. How am I going to find people to fit those jobs?
Yep.
And so when we went in person to reach out to employers to ask them if we could bring job candidates to fill their open positions, we would start from the position of, you as the business owner or the hiring manager, what's the thing that's keeping you up at night? What's the pain point that is a challenge for you? I could do so much more shipment if I had an export manager who had good relationships outside the U.S. I could run a more tight ship if I had a third shift and we could get workers here in the overnight hours, whatever that might be. And then tell a story about how the candidates we could bring them could help them meet that goal, right? Because if you just walk in the door and you tell an abstract story about how deserving this job candidate is, or how hard they work, or how qualified they are, the business owner can't see themselves in that story. And so I think that goes back to your point, right? You can tell a story about someone else and it can be okay. But if you tell a story that connects to the person you're trying to communicate with or be in relationship with, it is a much more powerful way to go about things.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And one of the ways that we, especially on this journey of public will building, we often counsel folks to tell those stories too, is to involve the broader American public who may not be like, they don't know about the kind of investments we're making or not, right, in skills development and skills training and workforce development. So they don't, so when they hear us talking about that, they don't know, right, that that's necessary, that there's something in there for them as well. It's like, no, you have a stake, right, in what's going to happen with this legislation, or you have a stake in what's going to happen, right, if we respond to what's happening, whether it's immigration or whether it's, the new AI or whatever it is. You have a stake in the decisions that we're making, and you're invited into this too. And I think that really, speaks to the kind of the core of our sort of democracy itself, like reminding people democracy kind of doesn't work unless we work it, right? So you've got a stake in this, and here's how you plug in, like telling those kind of stories of us and stories of we, are super important. And I don't know that, at least in the social justice space, I would say that we do that enough, right? So talk a little bit about those stories where you're trying to get not just legislators or policymakers or employers into the conversation, but you're trying to get the mom and pops who are sitting at home on their couches, trying to get their kids off to school in the morning on the school bus, trying to make sure they got dinner on the table, right? Trying to make sure that, whatever it is that they have to do on their personal lives get done. And they show up for us on things like this where we know that it matters.
I think what's so important about what you just said is the idea that democracy is a verb, not a noun, right? Mm-hmm. It's something you do, not mm-hmm. something that exists in isolation all by itself, right? And so you could say that about a whole range of particular policy issues, but it really is the civic fabric of this country, right? It's what we do to and with and in relationship to each other that creates the society that we're choosing to live in, right? It's not something that just happens to us.
Right.
When I was a child and people asked me what my parents did, and I would say they work in early childhood education. Get this straight, what is that, right? People knew preschool and they knew babysitting, but they didn't really understand what this concept of early childhood education was. Mm-hmm. And it took a long effort by a lot of advocates over many years. But what they did was they hooked into one of the most powerful stories we have, which is the story of dreams that parents have for their children. And so once you hooked into that larger story of, okay, what do parents want for their children? They want the best, the most opportunity, right? Mm-hmm. And now today, 30 plus years after that effort started, you can drive through neighborhoods of any wealth or background, and there'll be signs saying, Brightside Academy, Early Learning Center, mm-hmm. right? Because everyone has internalized the idea that we love our kids, we want them to have the best start in life, and that means having something intentional and caring and intellectually engaging and playful like early childhood education, as opposed to kind of imagining a sort of caretaking or warehousing of, okay, there's just a grown-up there to make sure this child is being babysat, right? Mm-hmm. And that, I think, is a beautiful example of hooking a broader policy goal of we need to invest in younger children and making sure that public policy is making those investments to a dream that is almost universal, right? I'm not even a parent. Mm-hmm. I have 8 nieces and nephews who are very beloved to me. And early childhood education is an issue that matters to me, too, even though I'm never going to be sending a child of my own to preschool.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Absolutely. And I love that. And I love how that example also speaks to, I think, the evolution, right, of our narratives, right, and our sort of mindsets around issues, right? Early in my career, I did a lot of sort of framing experiments around, if you frame early child development in this way, could you get more people to lean in? If you frame it in that way, and those surveys and studies and research and polling is great, right? But I think the other piece of that is like watching over time, the kind of evolution of those ideas, filter into the public, and how that in and of itself helps to then create the fertile ground that you need to move policy. And what a great example. And I can recount a lot of those. And I don't know that, I think in the social justice space where we really sort of stop and think, about that kind of evolution. But if you think about sometimes when I'm talking to folks, I'll make that leap and say, think about the things that are radically different today than they were 30 years ago, and the mindset shift that had to get us to this point. Even things like the use of how we use cell phones, or, driving a car and seat belts. And when I was little, seatbelt, strap a car seat in, you just put the kid in the, right? All kinds of things like that over time have shifted, one, because I think we've been able to make folks smarter about a whole range of things like early child development. But it's also that there's been a concerted effort, right, to move sort of narratives forward that help to shift the conversation. Yeah. Are there any narratives that you can think of that you think are just really important for us as we think about workforce development issues and sort of moving those issues forward, things that we want to tackle? I can think of a couple that are just like, when I hear them, I'll go, oh. Or alternatively, are there some narratives that you think, we have been able to overcome, right? I can think of a couple of those that just, 15 years ago, like, oh boy, in the workforce development space, that was not a good narrative to have, but it was pervasive. And today we might have grown ourselves, right? Through a lot of intentional effort and maybe even some help from, technology or whatever it is to have a different mindset about those things.
Yeah, I'm going to talk about one that can be both good and bad, right? So back in the day, 30 or 40 years ago, it was not uncommon in U.S. K-12 schools for students to be tracked. And you were either in the college track or you were in the non-college track. And if we were tracking you into the non-college track, then somehow we decided that you were not on track to attend a 4-year university. You might not need the same level of academic preparation, and we were going to steer you towards a vocational program. The challenge about that was that it wasn't a choice made in full awareness of people's aspirations and dreams and with the supports available to them to follow whichever path was appropriate and interesting to them. It was a decision that was disproportionately being made by the folks in charge, folks who often look like me, right? Middle-aged white people. And we have copious evidence to suggest that students of color and poorer students disproportionately got steered into career tracks that maybe weren't necessarily right for them, but they were all that the people advising them could imagine for them, right? There was a lack of imagination, a kind of poverty of imagination among the guidance counselors or the teachers or the folks who had power over writing a recommendation letter, giving a kid a waiver to be able to take the SATs for free if they couldn't afford them, right? And then there started to be activism and critique about that from parents, from students themselves, from other advocates to say, wait a minute, we should give everyone the opportunity to go to 4-year college. And we shouldn't be in the business of trying to make decisions for other people, and particularly adults making decisions for children about what they're capable of or what's possible for them, right? And so that was a more asset-framed way of thinking about people instead of a deficit-framed way. And the pendulum swung so far in that direction that we started to act as though 4-year college was, in fact, the only path to success. And we devalued some of the really high-quality pathways in career technical education, right, which is the more modern name for vocational education. And now the pendulum is swinging back closer to the middle, where we say, okay, people should have the full panoply of options available to them, right? We should not be arbitrarily cutting off possibilities for preteens or teenagers by making assumptions about because they're a girl, they're not interested in shop class, or because they're a boy, they might not want to be a psychologist. We don't want to make sexist assumptions or racist assumptions or any kind of assumptions. We want to make sure that young people have pathways, a broad array of pathways available to them. But we also don't want to just shunt everyone into one pathway under the assumption that that's the only way you can get to a high-paying job that can support yourself and your families. We should have multiple on-ramps to what a good job looks like, and not necessarily force people into something that might cause them to acquire a great deal of debt and not actually come out the other end of it with what they want to achieve, right? We're not all the way there yet, right? We still have problems at both ends of the spectrum, right? We're either steering people where it's not appropriate to be steering them. We're rah-rah cheerleading for one career path instead of leaving open other career paths. But it is something that we have wrestled with as a society and continue to wrestle with to try to make sure that we are honoring the possibility and the assets and the curiosity and the potential in every young person without arbitrarily cutting that.
Yeah, I love that. And I love to hear you give voice to that last part, the sort of aspirations of folks. Because sometimes I think, especially in the current environment where things feel tough, everything feels stuck, everything is in crisis, folks are nervous and anxious about what's happening in the world. People can get stuck in that space of nothing is working, nothing can work, but just that ability to sort of lift people back up into aspiration. It's in our case making, that's our first principle. Like, you got to connect to people's bigger aspirations for their own lives, for their own families, right, to the world they live in, period. And when you do that, it kind of gives people a different way to entertain a conversation that's very different than I'm nervous, I'm afraid, right? I'm trying to build walls around things, which is kind of where our news and information and sometimes even our best public policy analysis send people, right? We start yelling at people all the negative stuff, and then they shut down. And then we're like, well, why aren't they following us to figure out what comes next? Because you just shut them down, right, with all the negative stuff. So speak to that, because I love that last part where you were really getting into kind of the aspiration, not just of students, but just of who we are, right? I think as a society, and what that does to people when they are given the opportunity to remember that and sit in that.
This is something I learned the hard way, right? I'm a book person. I'm often persuaded by learning things, by reading about them. I find facts and numbers really appealing. And it was not until I was a full-grown adult and I saw some examples of how the arts can move people. And, in immigration, there's a saying, right? You can't reason people out of a belief they didn't reason themselves into, right? You can't have a brain-level conversation when people are reacting from their heart or from their gut. And you talked about this just a minute ago when you talked about how sometimes people are emotionally, they're kind of in a defensive crouch, right? They're shutting down because so much in the world seems catastrophic or difficult or painful, right? And I have been astonished. There's a great young artist. His name is Ramiro Gomez Jr. He's in Los Angeles. And one of the things he does in his art is he creates cardboard cutouts of immigrant workers and puts them up in everyday places, right? So it's a cardboard cutout of a landscaper, and he'll put it up as an installation by a hedge, right? A cardboard cutout of an immigrant a housekeeper, and he'll put that up. So this is temporary installation art. It only lasts for a few days or a few weeks until the weather, disintegrates it. But it is about making visible the work of the people who are often overlooked and invisible in everyday life. And people have had these very emotionally moved responses to his art, not because they didn't already know intellectually that there are lots of people in our world who do jobs like, making the gardens and the bushes look beautiful and stay healthy and helping our homes stay clean. They just hadn't emotionally connected with it. And so it has been a learning process in all of my adult life to realize that sometimes you can have the smartest policy person in the world who has a fancy degree from wherever and facts and figures to the end. And what you really need is a theater kid. You need a theater kid who can tell a story, and a communications professional or an artist. I've been to several conferences where they'll have an artist who is live sketching in kind of like an editorial cartoon or doodle format, the key takeaways from the conference. And at the end of the conference, you have this beautiful, easel or piece of butcher block paper that has in, key letters and phrases with colors and design showing these are the big phrases that came up over and over again in the conference, or this was a thing people felt stuck on. And it's a visual representation of several days of human interaction, and it can get shared, and it's incredibly powerful. And so this is something that, as I said, in the early part of my career, I undervalued arts and culture. I undervalued the theater kids of the world. And I like to think now at age 47, I am more appropriately valuing what the arts can bring to helping jolt people out of that inertia or that deficit thinking or that stuckness.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Love that. And I would say that attends very well to some of the work that we do at the Case Made. When we counsel folks about how they make the case for a lot of their work, we said you got to have, head and heart, all that in the same case, but there's an order to it, right? It's the stuff that hits the heart and the gut first, right? And then, right, comes the more formal, like, you got to have your numbers right and all that other kind of stuff. Because both of those things for the folks who need to come at it from that vantage point, you got a little bit of that. And for the folks who need the data, information, and numbers, you got to have a little bit of that. So I want to have a conversation about that second part. So now that we've sort of established that sometimes we flip the order, like we start with all the sort of data stuff first and the hardcore, right, to the exclusion of the stuff that actually hits heart and gut, right, which is a challenge for us. But now let's talk about the data, right? You started off in this conversation just talking about like data is in part what gives you some of that credibility in the conversation. And one of the things that we often counsel folks to do in our work is data is great. And usually the way that we use it and the data that we produce is usually the wrong data in the sense that it's usually the negatively framed or deficit level data. So we're going to give you all the statistics about all the kids who are poor. We're going to tell you about all the lack of, how many schools are not performing at, grade level or kids that are not performing at grade level. How many schools are not graduating this many percentage of the students? How many new employers are not going to have? So it's all about deficit because we think that if we tell people about all the things that are wrong or tell people all the things that are awful, that's the stuff that makes them, that pull them forward. And we know from a lot of good social science that the opposite is true, right? That it's not the deficit that makes me go, oh my God, there's new challenges that I need to go solve, right? That pulls me forward. It's feeling like there's a sense of opportunity. So saying, man, the smartest investment we could make right now is investing in the schools that are more challenging because when we do that, the impact that we can have is so much greater or whatever it is. Or, imagine the number of kids. If 50% of our kids are doing well, we're already 50% of the way there. What would it look like to make sure that we bring the other 50% forward? Come on, guys, and we can do this. That there's something about feeling like there's momentum in the thing, that there's some forward movement that is actually the data that pulls you forward, right? And so that's the information. That's the way you want to frame it. Not just in terms of assets, but in terms of momentum, in terms of solutions, in terms of, right, rising momentum. So speak a little bit to that. If data is what part of the thing that gives us credibility in the space, how do we, in the context potentially of, workforce development and skills, right, bring that kind of forward momentum data forward to get people really excited about joining us on this journey?
I love what you just said about the kind of potential and the asset framing and giving people that sense of momentum. I think about it in the best sense of the word as everybody wants to jump on the winning team's bandwagon.
Yes.
Right? That is very energizing. Yes. And so we have to just give them a reason to hop on that bandwagon as opposed to, just telling them, ain't it awful and isn't it catastrophic and, and everything's kind of dire and, we should somehow be motivated to act because I've now told you how bad everything is. So I'll give you a very concrete example from my own work. So one of the things that we often do is work with legislators to try to get them to invest more in opportunities for people to build skills so they can get better jobs. And we looked recently at digital skills, and our research had a couple of key findings. First, we had some findings about the current level of digital skills among workers. Second, we had some findings about the amount of help wanted ads that require digital skills. And then we had some qualitative data from employers and workers about how digital skills are showing up in their jobs right now. And so when I put that together into a presentation for folks, I start with the vignettes about how digital skills are showing up in real life. right? And I tell people some really crazy fun stories like, hey, did you know there's a Fitbit for cows? And if you are a dairy farmer, your cows may be wearing this Fitbit to track their movements so that you can get some early warning in case the cow is sick. But guess what? That means that your dairy workers now need to be able to troubleshoot this equipment, right? And they need to have the digital skills to be able to, figure out, is it not working because it's not getting the Wi-Fi signal? Is it not working because the cow, brushed up against the side of the barn and damaged the battery? Who knows, right? And then we share the information about, okay, U.S. workers' current level of digital skills. And we used to share this 5 years ago as, well, this is how many people don't have digital skills. And we switched the framing to say, this is the number of people who need opportunities to build their digital skills and need investments in their digital skills. That's a very subtle shift, but it's an important one. And then the third thing we do is say, okay, here's the demand for digital skills. Here's the percentage of help wanted ads in agriculture and food service, you name it, where employers are looking for digital skills. So if we are thinking about how to make sure businesses have the skilled workforce they need, how workers can get good jobs and support themselves and their families, we need to invest in their ability to build digital skills. And then the very last thing I say is something that came from a gentleman that I talked to in a not very wealthy area of Washington, D.C., who teaches a job skills program. And he told me, most of the people I'm serving, they have fragmented knowledge. They're comfortable with some digital skills, but they're not comfortable with others. So maybe they use their smartphone for texting or to use an app, but they're not comfortable in navigating Microsoft Office or using an electronic health record. So the trick is to help people build from the skills they have to the skills they need. And that's the story that we're telling as part of our argument for why public policy needs to invest in digital skills. It's a vision of a world that is both cool and a little bit funny, right? Fitbits for cows, very memorable. People will go home and tell their spouse at the dinner table, like, you will not believe what exists in this world. But it also kind of jolts their perceptions, because their perception is, okay, well, does a dairy worker really need to have computer skills? Maybe not. But now it's like, okay, well, I'm not telling you that dairy worker is going to spend many hours a day sitting at a desktop computer. Right. I'm telling you that the kind of digital skills they're going to be using on the farm is, the kind of troubleshooting that I was describing.
Love that. Love that. Love that. And that's an example of, in my book, I call that slow braining the conversation. Like, you start with something that stops people for, like, they have to slow down the process. Like, wait, Fitbit for cow. Like, wait, what? What are you talking about? And in that moment, what you do is you stop people's sort of mental process, and you stop them from, right, thinking about all the other 10,000 other things that are going on in their heads, to be able to focus for a second on what you're saying. And when you do that, right, it helps to pull people forward. And we can see that in a lot of our, communications, that sometimes people are just processing so much information. Most folks are going through their day with just so much going on. And even as they're having conversations, right, their brains are not slowing down. They're fast. It's what, Daniel Kahneman talked about, thinking fast and slow. We're thinking fast all the time, unless something slows us down, or we have to sort of take for a few minutes to, like, wait, what did you just say for a second? Right. And so that's a beautiful, example of that principle kind of in action, of like how you just kind of slow people down a little bit to force them to kind of really, really process, wait, because then they want more information about it and they can't stop thinking about it. And just exactly what you said. And they go home that night and they're like, honey, let me tell you what I just learned about. Can you believe it? Right. And it's a whole thing. Right. And then it allows that conversation to become viral, because now you've, right, slowed them down, made them process, but also giving them something to share that they, want to share with other folks. So that's a great example. So now I want to go into that a little bit more, because one of the things that's really implicit, we haven't brought this out fully, but that's implicit in a lot of examples that you gave, was a conversation about equity, right? Because you're really making, in most of the conversation that we've had so far, you've been really talking about making the case for folks who are not likely to be the ones to be invested in terms of their skill set, right? So if you're talking about, agricultural workers, they don't always benefit from all the, major investments that we're giving to folks to get their skills up to be able to participate in the next leg of whatever our economy looks like. And so you're right. You've given us some really good examples of how to do that without, saying the word equity, without, beating people over the head with a conversation about equity. You sort of allowed folks to kind of have that conversation. But now I want to really go further into that, right? There's a lot of intentionality in what you're talking about in terms of just thinking about equity, whether it's digital equity or other forms of equity. Like, we've got to figure out how to get resources to folks who need it most, the folks who never really get the best opportunities for jobs. They never get the best opportunities for buying a decent house in a great neighborhood. Like, they never get, right, those kind of things. Because that also is a part of, right, I think the exercise of, the promise of our democracy, that we all get a shot at something, right, meaningful in terms of our lives. So talk a little bit about how you think about the issues around equity, the kind of intentionality that you all are bringing to it, or just the way that you get people to embrace equity, sometimes explicitly when you can have the opportunity to do that. And sometimes when you can't be explicit, like I call it putting the carrots or the Brussels sprouts inside of the apricots or inside of the bananas, right? To get it in there, right? Because, we need that. It's good for our country to have that in there.
Yeah. So I have a lot of experience in my life of talking with people who might not agree with me on a lot of things. And one of the places I often start that conversation is with values. And I'll tell them a value that my grandfather or my parents taught me, right? My parents taught me it was important to make sure that everyone had equal opportunities to contribute. Or, I also start with place, right? I'm a Philadelphian. Philadelphia is one of the oldest cities in the United States. It is a plurality African-American city. It is a city with an incredibly long history of free Black Americans dating into the 1700s, building institutions and schools, the first HBCU in the country, I will be happy to add. And so there are things that I am proud of as a Philadelphian that I will start a conversation with sometimes, because I don't think we should run away from equity. I think particularly for me as a middle-aged white lady, I know I have blind spots. I know I'm still learning, but it is absolutely a responsibility that I take very seriously for me to say that this matters to me as a value that I hold. Not because I am some benevolent, patronizing person talking about other people, but because this is a value that is important to me, and that in order for me to live up to my own ethics and my own morality and my own standards for how to behave, I need to take this seriously. And that means listening to people who have life experiences that are different from mine. That means designing policies in ways that reflect the things that are a variety of different life experiences, right? I've never been a parent, right? I have been a person who was working full-time during the day and trying to go to school at night. I can imagine one of my closest friends in college was a single mom trying to work during the day and keep her child in school and together and, all those things that parents are trying to do. And it was abstractly clear to me before I met her why it was important to do things to support parents. But once I actually got to interact with her, one of the most personal things she told me after we had talked for months and months was she said, I did try to sign my daughter up at one point for public health insurance, but the caseworker was so humiliating to me and so dismissive and judgmental that I just left and I never went back, right? And I figured out some other way to get my daughter the health care she needed. And I thought, well, that seems unfair, right? Like that just triggered all my unfairness things.
Yeah.
And I thought, okay, that's not the society that I love. That's not the world I want to live in. And I do go back to Baldwin, right? James Baldwin said, I love America more than any other country in the world. And exactly for that reason, I insist on the right to criticize America. And so if you love something, you want it to be the best version of itself that it can be. And so in a policy advocacy standpoint, I work in all 50 states. In some states right now, there are governors who are doing executive orders on racial equity, who are disaggregating data and saying, our job training program's doing a good job of serving workers of color. Oh, look, this training program isn't doing such a great job. What can we learn from that? How can we change that? Mm-hmm. And there are governors who are striking the word equity from state policies and rolling back DEI initiatives. Mm-hmm. And it's my job to keep bringing forward the values that I hold and that my organization advocates for, regardless of the landscape that we're trying to navigate. Now, that doesn't mean that I just barrel ahead and have the exact same conversation, regardless of what setting, right? You have to read the room. You have to know. That's right. But I do try to lean into the fact that, I'm a fourth generation American. I'm a native English speaker. I have a college education. I'm a middle-aged white lady. There are things I can say that some of my colleagues who don't have those backgrounds have a harder time being heard if they say those same things. That's right. And so it's kind of on me to, not shy away from the fact that, okay, sometimes people may disagree with me or may dislike what I've said. And I'm constantly balancing, when is it helpful to press more? Mm-hmm. And when is that going to backfire and actually hurt the people that I'm trying to advocate for and with?
That's right. That's right. And I love that you said that. I think that's especially in this particular moment, folks are constantly trying to figure that out, right? That question, like, is it, we all know from my vantage point that we're trying to build an America where everybody gets a shot at success. And that means pressing into equity. But in every conversation, you got to figure out, like, is this the right time to press, or is this the right time, right, to think about some other way to get that in, because you don't want to undermine the effort, right, to actually win the thing that you're after, right, which is, right, more investments and skills training and skills development and all of that. So I want to just ask you, I mean, in the midst of all of that, like, what are you most, when you think about the outlook, especially around sort of skills, development and investments in our country today, what are you most optimistic about as you look at the landscape? Like, we got a lot of things that are challenging, but wow, there is some really great opportunity in front of us if we lean into, or I see some really great developments, right, in this space or that. What are you most optimistic about when you look out at the landscape?
First of all, two things. One, we have generationally huge investments that Congress has made in infrastructure, in clean energy, in broadband and high-speed internet, just tens of billions of dollars that is flowing to states and flowing to other entities. So we're actually paying the true cost of what it will take to build out high-speed internet in rural communities that haven't had it for years. Like at the beginning of the pandemic, my governor here in Pennsylvania was trying to do video press conferences from his home. And because his home was in central Pennsylvania and not in the big city centers of Philadelphia or Pittsburgh, he didn't have reliable internet, right? The governor, right? And so, Congress has made these enormous generational investments through the CHIPS and Science Act for semiconductor manufacturing, through the Inflation Reduction Act around tax credits and other incentives for clean energy and climate resilience, and the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, building roads and bridges and high-speed internet, all these great things. And so that is incredibly powerful. Most people didn't hear the CHIPS and Science Act and think childcare. But actually, childcare is in the bill. It is actually in the bill to say, if we're going to spend $1 bajillion, technical term there, building out more semiconductor chip manufacturing in the U.S., right? We used to manufacture most semiconductor chips in the world. Now we only manufacture a small fraction. We want to bring more of that manufacturing back here to the U.S. and have folks get those well-paying jobs. We want there to be childcare associated with those companies so that folks who are parents have an equitable shot at being able to get those good jobs. And so that to me is very optimistic. The other thing that I think is incredibly optimistic is the number of women who are doing extraordinary things in this country against very hard uphill struggles, right? And I should say women and non-binary people, right, or gender fluid people, because this is still a world in which a lot of men disproportionately hold political, economic, social power. Mm-hmm. And yet, in librarianship, in digital equity, in racial equity, in huge areas of advocacy, I get on phone calls and it's all women. The lawyers are women. The communications professionals are women. The artists are women. The folks in the trenches are women, right? And so it is exceptionally exciting to me that even people who are disproportionately marginalized in our society are not waiting to be invited in or given permission or a seat at the table, but are actually driving forward good policy without waiting. Now, here's the piece that's hard, right? President Biden had this big infrastructure bill. It passed. He also had a big bill on the care economy, and it didn't pass. Mm-hmm. And I think the reason it didn't pass is because we have not gotten to a point in this country where Congress is hearing the powerful story of caregiving and why caregivers need to be invested in. All of us at some point in our lives will need care, and most of us at some point in our lives will give care. And caregiving is the work that makes all other work possible. And this is really central to me because in the last year, I spent 10 months working with a friend circle. We were caring for a terminally ill friend. She was dying of brain cancer. And the only reason that I was able to do that was because I had an employer that was very understanding of my need to take short notice time off and support my caregiving responsibilities. We don't have a society that's set up to do that right now. And so I think I have all that optimism about the good investments Congress made and the amazing work that women are doing. I think we need to keep pressing to get those care economy investments to match the other kinds of infrastructure investments we've made.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Absolutely. That just reminds me, many moons ago, I won't tell you how many moons, I did my dissertation on this very issue around the family medical leave. We're one of the few countries in the world that doesn't actually pay for family medical leave, which not only covers obviously maternity and paternity kinds of issues, but just the kinds of issues you're talking about. It should cover, your ability to be with a loved one who's terminally ill or or even just to take the sick time you need to kind of, sometimes the body shuts down and it needs some care and you got to take yourself out of the labor market, right? To be able to do the thing that gives you self-care, whatever that looks like, mental health, emotional health, whatever that is, so that when you return, you can actually give yourself, the full energy of yourself back to, right? Whatever professional, employment that you at. And my dissertation was on what it looks like, right? The sort of economic and social cost of not providing the same kinds of pay that folks get in other countries. You have a baby if you're in France or you're in Germany or these other countries, you get a good, at least 18 months, almost 2 years out of the labor market for the purposes of bringing a wonderful, beautiful life into the world and making sure they get the best possible start. And it matters, right? Not just from the vantage point of you getting a chance to hug your baby, but just because you want to have, totally great functioning, emotionally balanced people who've got strong mental and emotional attachment to the care and well-being and feeding of the communities around them. And we are doing such we're challenged by not making the kinds of investments in this culture that would allow that to flourish. And I think that has implications, right, in all kinds of things, right, that we could talk about that are not so great because we're not providing that. We're having to pay for it in other ways that are ways we really don't want to have to pay for it. So love that.
And we're 360-degree human beings, right? We're not these flat two-dimensional widgets that you can kind of slot in and slot out of a job, right? Capitalism is very happy to honor the work that workers do, but we have been less good historically in this society about honoring all the other things that people are, right? They're aunties and they are stage managers and they are gardeners and they are sports players and you could go on and on and on, right? Early in the pandemic, my 2-year-old nephew came into the room when his father was on a video call. And when he got off the video call, he said to my brother, his father, he said, what were you doing? And my brother said, I was on a video call with a colleague. And my nephew said, is he real? And my brother said, yes, he's real. He's a real person. And then my nephew said, does he have feet? And under intense questioning from a 2-year-old, my brother was forced to acknowledge that actually he'd never met this guy in person, right? Because it was COVID, it was lockdown, everything was remote. He had no idea if this guy had feet. He technically did not know that this man had feet, right? And I do feel like in our society sometimes we're so focused on the kind of two-dimensional versions of people that we never stop and step back and say, does this person have feet? Like, what is the 360-degree view of the human that is this person, as opposed to just this flat version of this person as only a worker or only a consumer, right? Who's at the grocery store buying groceries. Of course you're a consumer, but you're also like someone who's going to cook for dinner that night.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Love that. Love that. Well, listen, Amanda, I could literally talk to you forever and ever. This conversation went a lot like the conversation we had before, and we could just jive in on each other's and just going back and forth, kind of riffing off each other's comments. I'd love that. But I want to just ask you a final question, just kind of get your juices flowing once more, just thinking about this issue of justice and in everything that, we do at the Case Made. In fact, we ground our work in efforts to make the case around issues that we feel like there's a justice, right, part of this, that it's not just that people need and deserve and they should have, and but that it is about the just world that we want to live in, and that, anybody who's on that trajectory, they're trying to figure out how to do just work, right, for a just economy or a just workforce or a just community, whatever that is, we want to lean into it. And I often ask people, what's the justice journey that they're on? For me, the justice journey that I'm on is really trying to do the absolute best I can to make sure that everybody around me, right, has what they need to thrive, right, at any given time. And I want to work to help to train, to inspire, folks who are also trying to give their absolute best in that way as well, which is one of the reasons why we're on the call today, because I feel like in you there is, a kindred spirit in terms of having that inclination. But I'd like to give folks the opportunity to talk about, what's your justice journey? When you think about, the best possible aspiration of who you are in terms of justice, share that a little bit with us and close us out on that.
Love this question. So when I was 17 or 18, I had a kind of embarrassing realization. I was studying the American Revolutionary War, and I realized that if I had been alive back then, my instinct would have been to have been a Tory, to have been on the side of like, oh, I don't think we should change anything. I think these revolutionaries are kind of, upsetting and dangerous. And that was really startling to me as a 17 or 18-year-old. Why would I have been on the wrong side of history? And I realized that I'm kind of a temperamentally conservative person. And so since that time, over the last 30 years, I have been very deliberate about trying to surround myself with people and readings and learnings that are more radical and more courageous than my normal instinct sometimes is to be. And to say to myself, can I sit in my discomfort and the part of me that's just like, oh, I don't want to change things. I think things seem pretty fine right now the way they are, or at least maybe they won't be worse if we don't change anything. And instead, lean into the possibility and the curiosity and the bravery of saying, yeah, but what if they were great? Like, okay, they're fine now, but what if they were great? And also, like, they're not fine now for a lot of people. And so we shouldn't be satisfied with that. That's not okay. So that's the first thing I would say. The second thing I would say, there's two touchstones that I have found helpful that are from other people. The first is the saying that I'm sure you're familiar with, which is be a good ancestor, right? Are you doing things now that your future descendants would be proud to say that you did? Right? If I look back in my own family tree, there are certainly folks who did things that I wince and cringe at, and I think, gosh, that's not something I would want to lift up and brag about. And then there's one or two ancestors who've done some really cool things. I go, that's pretty cool. Okay, I'd like to be that person. And then the second thing is a wonderful saying that I saw somewhere on social media, and I can't credit the person because I don't know who it was, but it said, live your life so that the biography of you after you die will be a banned book. And I thought, that is fantastic, right? Live your life in a way that is so bold and so courageous that when they write about you after you die, somebody somewhere will get mad and try to ban that book. It's like, okay, if that is just, and that sometimes means practicing being uncomfortable. And I'll tell you one last little story. So I realized a long time ago that you can get a lot more done in life if you're not afraid to look ridiculous. And I did that when I was a college student taking a sociology course, and we all had to do something that was deviant but not illegal. And my sisters were horrified that I was going to wear my clothes backwards in our hometown. They're like, people know us here. You should do it somewhere else. And I was like, I'm just wearing my clothes backwards. It's fine. But, I was on a train where somebody started having a seizure. Right. And a lot of people were kind of pausing and looking around. And I realized I didn't know how to help the person with a seizure. I don't have medical training. But what I wasn't afraid to do was look ridiculous. So I stood up and I yelled really loudly, does anyone have medical training? Right. And sure enough, there was a nurse and she came and she helped. Right. And so I've tried to take that lesson with me, too, which is sometimes you can't be afraid of being conspicuous or even having other people think that you're too earnest or you're too, gauche or you're too ridiculous. Like, sometimes you need some ridiculousness to get things done.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Absolutely. I love that. And on that note, we're going to close out today. I want to thank you, Amanda. That was absolutely phenomenal. It is going to help so many folks who are leaders in their respective fields, who are trying to advocate and make the case for all kinds of things that are on their justice journeys. And so I just wanted to say thank you so much for taking the time today. And I'll make sure that folks have your information so if they want to reach out there, your email and the website of your organization. And
always love hearing from folks. Yes. Well, thank you, Dr. T. I think your book and the work that you're doing at the Case Made is really exciting because it says like what we have now isn't good enough. And there's so much more we could be doing. And there are tools that you can offer folks to help them do those things. And that's just really exciting.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And we'll be in touch soon.
Sounds great.
Bye-bye. Thanks so much for joining me today. Every new conversation we have with a fierce case maker gives me new energy for the road. And I hope that as you listen today, you felt the same way. I believe in case makers everywhere. And if you don't quite see the fierce case maker in you just yet, hold on, just trust, work those principles so that you can bring new champions to your justice journey. And if this information inspired you, then please be sure to like, share, and subscribe so that you can be one of the first folks who knows when a new episode is dropped. And until next time, stay fierce.